1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Talk Spock, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and child care become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died?
Last episode, we covered Dr. Benjamin Spock's family background and how his early advantages set him up for success. In this third episode of Talk Spock, we are going to talk about how Dr. Benjamin Spock's rise to prominence was part of a societal shift that took place after industrialization, where male experts worked to professionalize parenting advice. This shift parallels how pregnancy and childbirth were medicalized. In the 1900s, child rearing and parenting became the province of experts, and their advice was monetized.
And by experts, you mean specifically male experts, right? I mean, the generations of women who had been birthing and raising babies prior to the early 1900s couldn't possibly have been considered experts in the field.
You're right.
Okay.
Spock's biographer, Thomas Mayer, wrote that before the enchantment with science in the 20th century, most parents sought advice from the Bible and their local preacher. Now, by most parents, Mayer means white colonial settlers, which is fine, but that's describing a very small subset of people. And I think that Mayer misses the target here a little bit. There was no one paternal authority. Child rearing was like pregnancy and childbirth, the province of the domestic sphere. It was matriarchal. For a lot of human history, parents of young children lived close to or with their parents. And baby care was shared labor, and the knowledge of what worked was passed down informally and in a practical, hands-on way.
Exactly. I have trouble imagining that the local preacher was consulted more than one's mother, grandmother, sister, or even any other woman with direct experience with either childbirth or child rearing.
Mm-hmm.
I do love the idea of parenting as a type of apprenticeship, but maybe that's the wistful opinion of a rootless millennial who had her babies far from the practical, no-nonsense advice of her family. I would have much preferred to ask a trusted family member rather than the OB or pediatrician I saw for like a split second every few months, or a book that was invariably just as panic-inducing as it was reassuring.
Yeah, I would have benefited as a younger woman growing up from some more experience around young children and babies before becoming a mother myself.
Yes.
Back then, people didn't regard kids or conceptualize childhood the same way that we do now. Obviously, there were still babies and children, but they were more just a part of the family unit and incorporated into the daily work required for survival, like farming or hunting or like weaving, those types of tasks. But then when industrialization took this kind of work outside the home, the household was less a mini center of production. And instead of the families living and working together on like a farm, men went to work outside of the home. Women stayed at home to do the unpaid labor of tending to the house and children, and kids got to be kids, sort of. Some kids got to be kids, and other kids had to go work at a factory for like 14 hours a day.
And haven't we been seeing a bit of a renaissance on the child labor front?
Eesh, yes.
I, for one, welcome the opportunity for my children to put their nimble fingers to good use on the factory floor if it means I no longer have to ferry them to enrichment activities constantly. I should also just say, listeners, that this is a joke, and I cannot forget that this is only episode 3 of this podcast and not episode 155, and people may not know me as a jokester, a lighthearted jokester about the most terrifying issues of our time. That's me.
So you're not really going to send your kids to work in a factory?
No, although I may threaten it.
Folks moved to cities, and we're talking about the United States and Europe. where urbanization was taking place, people moved away from their families and they had fewer children. And this mobility disrupted the way parenting advice was passed down from grandparents to new parents because they no longer lived in the same place. In 1800, the average number of children born to a white woman was 7.04.
Can we just pause here? 7?
Yes.
That's like how we just sat down to watch the new Bridgerton television show, and Queen Charlotte is like, I've had 15 babies. And I'm like, I can't even, I don't get it.
Well, I know, and women also died when they were really young. So by the turn of the 20th century, the average number of children was 3.56, and by the end of the 20th century, it was 1.86. Girls and women who primarily did the child rearing had less experience with younger siblings, and many women found themselves raising families in situations quite unlike their mothers' eras, making the expertise of grandmothers less applicable. And all of these big societal changes worked to create a new market for parenting advice publications. And Katie, guess who got to write the advice?
Oh, wait. I have to think about it. But I have a feeling that since they seem to have been granted the authority to give advice about literally everything else, the answer is rich white men. And given that the title of this episode is Men Not Moms, I also feel like I have a good chance of being right.
If we had a ding, ding, ding sound effect, I would ring it right now.
Yes.
You are correct. In the mid-1800s, pediatrics and obstetrics didn't even exist as medical fields. But then in this vacuum of information, that gave an opportunity for a new professional group to take over. So men started to train as pediatricians and obstetricians. And in order to establish their expertise, they wrote books and they flaunted their MD designations, or an acronym FRS, which stands for Fellow of the Royal Society, which was a distinction for outstanding science research. I didn't know what that one stood for. I had to text our friend Kellen Backer to find that one out. And there's another acronym, DCI. I don't know what that one stands for, and I don't think the average reader in the 1800s did either, but they were impressed when people had letters after their name.
So I know we talked in previous episodes about the fact that training in medical schools was nowhere near as rigorous as it is today, but I am both horrified and entertained that it's the training in the thing and not the doing of the thing that qualified so many of these men as experts, able to write so-called definitive books on a subject.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you cannot imagine the definitive tome I was qualified to write after that Red Cross babysitting class I took at 12 years old.
I took that same class, and I felt like I was very qualified.
What would the letters behind our names be? Like RCCB, Red Cross Certified Babysitter. That's what would go on our book jackets.
So the same exact thing happened to child rearing. Male physicians were writing parenting advice and mothering advice, and they were going beyond health issues to sort of assert their qualifications. Therese O'Neill wrote about 19th and early 20th century mothering advice and sums them up as conglomerations of pseudoscience, unreasonable demands, and authoritative statements without foundation.
But think of the more sinister implication here. Men writing guides for raising ideal babies. Maybe not the birth of the strict and unrealistic standards of modern motherhood, but definitely a strong contributor. I mean, how could women insist on an equal place in society's power structures if they were too busy potty training their children at 6 months old?
And told that they were doing it the wrong way.
Yes.
Yeah, it took agency away from women, and it was all cloaked in this promise to help women.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a quick listen to a recording of Dr. Spock in a public health service announcement from 1965 that is in the public domain.
We show our love for our children in different ways. We give them good things to eat. We protect them from the cold or the heat. We teach them how to get along with each other. We comfort them when they're hurt. When they're sick, we do our best to get them well again. Even more important in the long run are the things we do to keep them healthy.
Thanks to the National Library of Medicine for that clip. So it's not controversial to want to take good care of children, but what I'm suspicious about is who gets to say what good care looks like. Atkinson writes that the public came to highly regard scientific information and seek expert guidance in aspects of their lives previously governed by traditional wisdom. So let's decode that a little bit. Experts were male physicians, and traditional wisdom was grandmothers.
I know I'm tipping toward my full-on feminist rant here, but I have to take a step back and think about what you've taught me about Spock thus far. How does he fit into this whole trajectory? I mean, yes, he's benefiting from this patriarchal structure, obviously, but he certainly doesn't seem to be the worst actor. At least he speaks from a place of experience.
Well, he got that book deal from Pocket Books. So he took the offer and wrote the book along with his wife, Jane, and it took them years. They weren't hasty about it. They really were intentionally trying to give good advice to parents. They gave up their social life. They stopped going out dancing in New York City so that they could stay home and Jane could type while Spock dictated the book to her. I find that the original title of the book is somewhat condescending, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care.
Well, Deborah, with all our flighty female notions, what we really needed was a man to tell us how to have common sense.
Mm-hmm.
Which, now that I say it, seems really silly because isn't the common sense stuff the stuff you wouldn't need to consult a book for?
So Spock claimed that he wrote all 526 pages in the first edition without consulting anything, and that it all came out of his head based on anecdotes from his medical practice, which, one, that's not true. Jane helped write the book, first of all.
I mean, I don't know how to feel about this statement. Like, on the one hand, I want to get advice from a medical professional who's on top of the latest professional literature, which it doesn't seem like Spock was if it all just came out of his head.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if what had counted for generations when it comes to childbirth and child rearing was in fact commonsensical advice based on personal experience, then this doesn't seem terrible. I mean, of course it was terrible for him to not adequately credit his wife. That I can state with certainty.
Mm-hmm. So Jane contributed, and he does cite sources, at least he does in the 1957 second edition, like the books Babies Are Human Beings.
What?
And Feeding Our Old-Fashioned Children. He cites some experiments about appetite and some 1942 experiments on babies. The publisher offered the services of a professional indexer, but Dr. Spock refused because he said, I think I know how mothers will look things up.
Cool. Okay, so not only are we robbing grandmothers of their authority by professionalizing medicine and making childbirth and child rearing the realm of male doctors, but the quote-unquote progress of modern society means they're being cut out of their families' lives entirely as families become more fragmented. That's pretty depressing for the grandmothers. And for everyone, I would argue.
Yeah, they're so negative about matriarchal knowledge. Late in Spock's career, he was awarded an honorary medical degree at Yale, and the Yale president, Kingman Brewster Jr., if ever there was a more authoritative sounding male name, right? He described Spock to an audience as, quote, the man who replaced the grandmother in the home.
I almost don't want to throw shade here because Dr. Spock looks so grandfatherly and kind in all his old photos. But it really says something about our society that we were so quick to replace this kind, wise, motherly presence and source of wisdom with a cold, inanimate book. I mean, books are great at giving factual answers, but they're not always great at providing comfort.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of how scientific knowledge was privileged in the 20th century above other types of knowledge, which in some aspects is great. Science gave us pasteurization, science gave us vaccinations, science is mostly good, but it also did this thing where it worked to promote American society as more advanced than other societies, as if all that matters in this world is progress, progress, progress. Spock actually wrote about this, about how in many parts of the world, grandmothers are considered experts. But in our country, he wrote, a new mother is often more inclined to turn to her doctor first. And this post-war period that he's working in was like a golden era of experts on a singular subject, like school guidance counselors, marriage counselors, social workers, psychologists. Ministers wasn't really a new profession, but people were turning to these experts to get advice and help with their personal problems in life.
Okay, so I know we have these like towering singular experts, but talk to me about who else Spock collaborated with. Like, what about the people he worked with in later editions? Who revises them, and what are their credentials?
You won't be surprised to learn that Spock always co-authored with men. Michael Rothenberg was his first named collaborator, co-authoring the 5th and 6th editions, published in the 1980s and 90s.
Parenthetically, let's never forget that Jane Chaney Spock was really a co-author on the first edition.
Mm-hmm. And Rothenberg was a pediatrician and child psychiatrist from the University of Washington in Seattle. So Spock's second wife, Mary Morgan, got the two together because she liked Rothenberg's ideas about TV violence, as in there should be less of it. Couple fun bits of trivia about Rothenberg. He once worked as a consultant on the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood show, and he wanted more money when it was time to revise the book for the 7th edition, and the Spocks found someone who would do it for less money.
No! I hate this because it goes against my kindly avuncular vision of Spock. And I know this was way before the heyday of brand synergy, but it seems like if Spock had been thinking clearly, he may have embraced the Mr. Rogers connection more. I mean, sure, Spock wrote the book on childcare, but was there anyone else more trusted by parents when it came to raising children in the late 80s than Mr. Rogers? Rogers plus Spock?
I think they actually knew each other.
Okay.
Because they both lived in, I want to say, Pittsburgh. I'd have to go back to the Mayor book and look that up, though.
Why weren't they constantly doing events together or co-publishing things? This seems like a potential gold mine.
Or Rogers and Spock on ice.
Hey, I would have seen it. Anyway, just please don't disabuse me of my notion that Fred Rogers would have been above any crass cash grab like that.
So there was another collaborator, Dr. Stephen Parker, co-authored the 7th edition, but he died relatively young. And we talked a little bit about in a previous episode about Robert Needleman, who revised the 8th, 9th, and 10th editions after Spock's death. And a quick library database search on Needleman turned up an article about how in the 1990s he founded an initiative called Reach Out and Read, acronym ROAR, that promoted reading in health clinics and doctors' offices nationwide by giving away books in waiting rooms.
Oh, up, Robert Needleman. That's great. As two former librarians, we really appreciate this about him.
Yeah. So there's nothing like groundbreaking or controversial about these collaborators. They just seem like good male pediatricians who got asked to help author the Spockian oeuvre.
Can I break in really quickly to say a word about Needleman, since he's the one that I feel most familiar with after reading the 10th edition?
Of course.
I just found his voice in the preface to be quite charming, and he was very upfront about the ways that parenting was and is still changing. And he was really frank with the way that he struggled to use the most inclusive language in his writing, but was trying. it went a really long way to putting my mind at ease about consulting a vintage work like Spock's.
Nice. That's good. So I think we can look at the phenomenon of the male expert a couple of different ways. Like, first, just at face value, there was a market-based need for childcare advice because of the trajectory of capitalism, and young parents, especially mothers, were without their traditional support systems, and parenting guides like Spock's were very helpful for some of those parents. And then I think we can look at it in a second, more like discursive way. Sometimes a baby care book presents itself to be full of universal and scientific recommendations, when actually the recommendations are more about changing middle-class norms than being evidence-based good science. So very broadly, to have one guy telling mothers what to do who based his information on anecdotal data from his pediatric practice in New York City is maybe working to, in a top-down way, influence people's behavior. And that can undermine mothers' agency, and it delegitimizes the folk wisdom, the way parenting information used to be passed on from grandparent to parent, because what people need for advice and information or advocacy is so dependent on circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's less the question of defining what is right for baby in a totally objective way than it is defining what is best for baby and presenting that as an objective fact. So, yes, your mother and your grandmother may have been doing things one way for generations, but it's really best to do it like so. And just like that, it's no longer about keeping your kids alive and fed and healthy and reasonably happy. It's suddenly about making sure they get into Ivy League colleges and land well-paying corporate jobs. On the surface level, it's removing women's worries about caring for their children by replacing them with a whole other set of worries that are about conformity rather than survival. I mean, you made a comparison offline that seemed really apt, but it may be because we've been aggressively scoping out Zillow listings lately. It's the Chip and Joanna gains and the sort of HGTVification effect. So a kitchen and a living room were good enough for our mothers. Having multiple rooms was not only good enough, it was a signal of success, right? You had enough money to have like these singular spaces to do specific things in. But suddenly, the best thing is to have a huge open concept multi-purpose space. Why? Because generations of families have found it to be the most efficient and effective way to organize a home? No, because some so-called experts decreed it should be so. And don't even get me started on shiplap.
It does look good in a magazine spread, though.
But I suppose we should return to the topic at hand. Was everyone reading Spock, Deborah?
That's a really good question. There are book sales numbers, but not numbers on reading comprehension of it. I, for one, have many parenting books that I've purchased and never read all the way through or even opened.
Well, yes, because a lot of them serve different purposes, right? Because some are reference works and you only consult specific sections when you need information in the moment about certain issues. I would kind of put Spock in that category. And then there are those that you read or don't read for a wider philosophical approach to parenting, like your attachment parenting guides, your Magda Gerbers, your Montessori explainers. Or there are the more aspirational ones, like, I mean, do we say aspirational or do we say like pop cultural ones? Like your Tiger Moms or your Bringing Up Babies. And then later you have your problem-specific ones like dealing with behavioral or developmental issues. I mean, I still have a whole shelf of these that I've only read 1 or 2 chapters of.
I have several ADHD books that look good on my bedside table and are not fun to read at all.
Yep.
So I haven't. So Spock's readership was pretty much white ladies, white moms. There's an interesting section in the book Raising America about Spock's work in the family clinic associated with Western Reserve Medical School, where he worked later in his career. So the Black mothers that went to this clinic did not always follow the clinician's advice, And in a letter to a contemporary who taught at Cornell, Spock wrote about how the African-American patients at the family clinic silently but firmly refused to take advice. Mothers fed their children as they always had, shared rooms and beds with them, toilet trained them early, and went back to work in a few months. He basically described why these mothers don't follow the clinician's advice because of their economic circumstances. And this is where having one main expert on a subject like child rearing is a problem. And that is, it puts the blame on the parents when they don't follow the advice. For many reasons, they may or may not be willing or able to follow the expert's advice, and then they can be scapegoated for problems that are really systemic. So it might appear that parents are being insubordinate when really the system is the problem, with economic and social barriers to what is narrowly defined as success. I read a New York Times piece from 1971 in which the author tried to argue that Black parents, she actually wrote Black mothers, so I'm editorializing here, that they needed their own Dr. Spock. But the Black experience in the United States was and is so starkly different than mainstream advice like Spock's that really only applied to white parents. There's a section in the article that really made me mad. It said that Black parents needed an expert who will teach mothers about problems like croup so they can handle them at home and won't head for the hospital every time a baby has an attack, because it's talking about this ER that has like a 3-hour wait time for kids with respiratory problems. But I can imagine this is in a neighborhood that has like high levels of air pollution probably. And perhaps what Black families in this New York neighborhood needed was for redlining to stop and for the system to pay them reparations, not that they needed their own Dr. Spock.
And haven't we spent the past generation convincing mothers that they need to trust doctors with problems like croup instead of trusting themselves to handle them at home?
Yeah, I don't think anybody can fault any mother who brings their infant who can't breathe to the hospital. Yeah. So that was a tough reading it 50 years later, because it was describing problems that are still around, like a racially biased carceral system, poverty, pollution. And it's just frustrating to me, a reader in the future, like nothing has really gotten better in some ways for a system that's rigged against anyone who's not white.
Yes, and it brings it back to the problem of there just having a singular voice to tell people what is the right way to parent.
Mm-hmm. I would love for there to have been more of a partnership between the science-y medical professionals and the folksy matriarchs, because it would be great to have both a science-based perspective and generational wisdom, both and. Spock's career was long, and he did change and develop along the way. In a future episode, we'll talk about how Spock actually listened to mothers and took feedback and used it to revise his book's later editions. Back to our original question, why was the Spock brand so enduring? Because the social, economic, and cultural trends made Americans absolutely hungry for an expert, and Spock fit that bill. He had the education, the look, the confidence, and the writing skills to pull it off. Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. Here is Spock on Bringing Home Baby from a list of equipment in the 1957 edition of Baby and Child Care. Mattresses made of foam rubber or hair keep their shape best, but they are more expensive. Occasionally hair, principally pig's hair, causes allergy in a susceptible child in an allergic family. Katie, what do later editions say about pig's hair mattresses?
Okay, so I know Spock knew how women would look up things in his book, so he didn't need professional indexers, but I bet he never predicted that I would use the search function on my Kindle to search through the entire 10th edition of his book, looking for any mention of pig's hair, and come up with a whopping 0 references to pig hair. So all the 10th edition says about mattresses is, quote, actually, there are a lot of mentions of mattresses, but we'll just pick this one out. It says, quote, "You may long for a beautiful bassinet lined with silk, but your baby won't care. Choose a crib, cradle, or bassinet with a firm, well-fitting mattress, one that doesn't show a dent when the baby is picked up."
Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. Please subscribe so you are sure to get our next episode, in which we'll explore how Dr. Benjamin Spock incorporated Freudian and psychoanalytic concepts into his work.
See this episode's show notes for our references. If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
Special thanks to the National Library of Medicine for the public domain Spock audio. We'll see you soon the next time we talk Spock.
Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.